A police officer stumbles upon a little girl in the forest, shivering with fever. But when he looks closer, he makes a shocking discovery that leaves him in panic. Before we dive into this emotional story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Officer John Parker was no stranger to the dense forests that surrounded Pinewood County. A veteran officer with over a decade of experience, he had navigated these winding, secluded roads countless times, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But that night, something was different. The storm had come out of nowhere, intensifying rapidly as he drove along the familiar route. Rain battered the windshield of his patrol car, obscuring his view, while the wind howled and thunder cracked above him like a warning from the heavens. Every few seconds, the headlights would flash on the dark, rain-soaked trees that lined the road, creating fleeting moments of visibility before plunging him back into the deep darkness of the forest. The road, slick with water, twisted ahead of him, and the only sound besides the pounding rain was the steady hum of the engine. The storm's intensity seemed unnatural, as if it had been summoned by some force to remind him of the danger and unpredictability of the wilderness. A sense of unease settled over John as he drove, the night feeling heavier, more foreboding than usual. The wind screamed through the trees, the sound so loud that it drowned out all other noises, as though the world itself was trying to warn him of something he couldn't yet see. John had spent years on this beat, so accustomed to the isolation of the forest that it had become almost second nature to him. But tonight, as the storm raged on, there was an undeniable sense that something was waiting for him, something far beyond the scope of a typical patrol. As he rounded a particularly sharp bend in the road, his headlights briefly illuminated a figure lying motionless in the middle of the wet asphalt. John's heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car slid slightly on the slick road, narrowly avoiding a crash. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he tried to maintain control of the vehicle. The rain pounded harder against the car, as if it were mocking his urgency, but he wasn't thinking about the storm now. His eyes locked onto the figure ahead, a small shape barely visible through the sheets of rain. His breath caught in his throat as he immediately shifted into action. Jumping out of the car, John's boots splashed into the puddles that had formed on the road as he sprinted towards the girl. The pounding rain and howling wind made it nearly impossible to hear anything other than the storm, but John's focus never wavered from the child lying before him. His thoughts raced. What was she doing here? Who could leave a child in the middle of the forest at night during a storm? As he knelt beside her, he could feel the wetness of her clothes through the rain-soaked fabric. She was a small figure, no older than 6 or 7, her body shivering uncontrollably from the cold and fear. Her clothes were soaked through, not just from the rain, but from what looked like days of neglect, as if she hadn't been taken care of in a long time. His heart tightened as he carefully checked for any signs of injury. He could feel the heat radiating off her fevered skin, and the faint pulse beneath his fingers told him she was alive, but barely. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "Hey, there, sweetheart. You're safe now. I'm Officer John. What's your name?" His words barely rose above the storm, but he could see the girl's eyes flutter open. The brown irises filled with fear locked onto his. She was too young to be here, too fragile to be left alone in such a state. As the girl's eyes struggled to stay open, she managed to whisper something that would change everything. Don't take me back," she said, her voice barely audible, trembling with fear. The words hit John like a physical blow, and he froze. His mind raced back to his own childhood, to memories of his daughter, Lily. She had disappeared 3 years ago, and the guilt still gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his failure to protect her. Could this little girl remind him of his own? Or was something darker at play here, something he couldn't yet understand? The words hung in the air as John fought to suppress the rising tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her softly, lifting her into his arms. She was light, too light for a child her age, almost frail. The girl clung to his uniform with surprising strength, her small fingers gripping his jacket like it was the only thing holding her to this world. "What's your name, honey?" John asked, his voice low and gentle, though his thoughts were racing. "Emma," she whispered, her voice strained, as though it took all her energy just to say the word. Her small hand tightened around his uniform, and John carefully carried her to his patrol car, every step feeling heavier than the last. He placed her in the back seat, wrapping her in the emergency blanket, her shivering body trembling even under the warmth of the car's interior. Her fear was palpable, and as John glanced back at her, the silent terror in her eyes made his chest tighten with unease. "What happened to you, Emma?" he murmured under his breath, but the girl remained silent. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle of this strange, unsettling encounter. How had she ended up here, alone in the middle of nowhere, during such a violent storm? No missing persons reports had come through the radio, and this was a remote area, far from any town or village. The questions piled up faster than he could answer them. As he started the engine, John's thoughts swirled. The storm outside seemed to echo his growing sense of urgency. He could hear the thunder and see the lightning flashing, but it wasn't the storm that filled him with dread, it was the girl. Her strange words, her fearful eyes, the weight of her silence. She had no memory of where she came from, no clear answers, and her request not to be taken back weighed heavily on John's mind. Was she running from something? Someone? And why was she so terrified? John tried to contact dispatch, but the storm's interference made communication nearly impossible. His radio crackled, the static drowning out any attempts at a conversation. The nearest hospital was about 20 minutes away, and Emma's fever was only rising. She was burning up, her breathing shallow, and she kept mumbling something about staying hidden, about not being found. As John drove through the storm, he looked at her again in the rearview mirror. She was starting to drift off, but he could see the unease in her face. The storm raged outside, but the emotional storm inside him was far worse. "Stay with me, Emma," John whispered, his heart aching for this frightened little girl. "We're almost there. You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he felt a nagging doubt in the pit of his stomach. Something about this whole situation didn't add up. The storm, the girl's condition, her cryptic words, everything about this felt wrong. And he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Emma was running from, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the hospital came into view, John's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with this little girl. The road ahead was unclear, just as her past was. But one thing was certain, this discovery in the woods would change both of their lives forever. As Officer John Parker's patrol car slid to a halt on the slick, rain-soaked road, the dim headlights illuminated the small, fragile figure lying motionless in the middle of the forest path. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. The girl was so small, barely visible through the sheets of rain that hammered against the windshield. His heart skipped a beat as he noticed the shivering, frail body of the child, lying in an almost unnatural stillness. She was no older than 7 or 8, her small frame hunched against the cold, drenched in rainwater that clung to her clothes like a second skin. John quickly threw the car into park and stepped out into the relentless downpour, his boots splashing through the puddles that had begun to form on the road. He barely noticed the chill in the air as his adrenaline kicked in. The storm was deafening, a cacophony of thunder, wind, and relentless rain that seemed to drown out every sound except for the pounding of his own heart. His flashlight flicked to life, cutting through the darkness as he moved toward the girl. His mind raced. What was a child doing out here, alone, in the middle of the storm? His gut churned with a deep sense of unease. She couldn't have been there long. Her body was still warm, radiating fever. But the circumstances were baffling, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong hung in the air like the storm itself. As he knelt beside her, his hand brushed against her shoulder, feeling the tremors of her small body as it shook uncontrollably from the cold and, more disturbingly, the fever. The girl's clothes were soaked through. They clung to her like a second skin, revealing that she was far too small for the age she appeared to be. Her pants were worn and ragged, and her jacket, if it could even be called one, was thin and inadequate for the storm's fury. As John gently lifted her head, he could see that her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and there were bruises on her legs, dark, ugly marks that spoke of abuse and neglect. His heart tightened in his chest. This child hadn't been out here, alone by choice. She had been left, and something about that realization made his stomach churn with anger. "Hey, sweetheart," John said softly, his voice barely audible over the thunder. He placed a hand on her trembling shoulder, trying to comfort her as best he could. "You're safe now. I'm Officer John. What's your name?" The little girl's eyes fluttered open, but her gaze was distant and unfocused. She blinked several times, as if trying to clear the fog in her mind. Her pupils were dilated, and her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. She looked at him with a sense of fear that struck John to his core. Don't take me back," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. The words were barely audible, but the sheer terror in them froze him in place. The intensity of her fear of something was palpable. John's chest tightened, his breath hitching in his throat. The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the storm itself had quieted. The girl's panic seemed to suspend time. His mind immediately went to his own daughter, Lily, and the years he had spent searching for answers about her disappearance. He thought of the fear he had seen in her eyes the last time he had held her, and the haunting guilt that still haunted him every single day. Without thinking, John gently placed a hand on the girl's forehead, checking her temperature. The heat radiated from her like a furnace. Fever. High fever. The kind that could kill if left untreated. He needed to get her out of here. She needed medical help. He had to act quickly. "Don't worry," John said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the overwhelming flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, okay?" The girl's trembling hand weakly grasped his uniform, clutching it with a surprising amount of strength. Her grip was tight, desperate. She was clinging to him as if he was the only thing holding her to this world. John's stomach tightened again as he gently scooped her up into his arms. She was so light, too light for a child her age. He could feel the weight of her small frame pressing against him, her fragile body barely registering the comfort of his touch. His thoughts raced. Where had she come from? What had happened to her? How had she ended up alone in the middle of a storm on a deserted forest road? The questions surged, one after another, but he pushed them down for now. He had to focus. He had to get her to safety. Carefully, he made his way back to the patrol car, every step weighed down by the gravity of the situation. The girl's head rested against his chest, her body shuddering in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, but she was still alive. That small breath was enough to keep him going, to push him through the mounting panic that seemed to rise within him. John opened the back door of his car and placed her in the seat, wrapping her in his emergency blanket as best he could, his hands shaking. As he buckled her in, he noticed how thin she was, how frail. Her body, so delicate and fragile, seemed to shrink further under the blanket, her small frame barely taking up any space in the back of the car. She looked so out of place, like she didn't belong in this world, in this storm. "Stay with me, okay? You're safe now," John said softly, as if his words could somehow erase the terror she had just experienced. His voice, a quiet promise amidst the deafening storm, was the only comfort he could offer in that moment. The little girl turned her head slightly, her eyes barely open, and looked up at him. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and fear, but beneath the surface, John saw something else, a flicker of trust, a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this officer could protect her from whatever it was she had been running from. "You're safe," John repeated, his voice firm, though the weight of his own doubts lingered. Was she really safe? Or was she merely exchanging one nightmare for another? And what about those words she had whispered? "Don't take me back." Who, or what was she hiding from? As he started the engine, the storm raged on outside, the wind howling like an animal in pain, the rain falling in relentless sheets. But John wasn't focused on the storm. He was focused on this fragile little girl who had appeared from nowhere, who had been left alone, her small body shivering with fever, her eyes filled with unspeakable fear. John's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he looked back at her through the rearview mirror. She was still awake, her eyes barely open, but she was watching him, her small hand clutching the emergency blanket tightly. Her breathing was more even now, but it was still shallow, still labored. He had to get her to the hospital fast. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he said again, though he knew the road ahead wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. Whatever was waiting for him at the hospital, whatever secrets this girl was carrying, were only just beginning to unfold. As he drove, the questions continued to swirl in his mind. Where had she come from? Who was she? And most importantly, what was she running from? The storm raged on outside. But for the first time that night, John Parker couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just dealing with a lost child. He was dealing with something much bigger, something that might change both of their lives forever. As Officer John Parker carefully placed the little girl into the backseat of his patrol car, his thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and concern. The storm outside had become even fiercer, the rain hammering against the car like a relentless force, but the weather was the least of his worries. His focus was entirely on the fragile child lying in the back seat, wrapped in the emergency blanket he had thrown over her small frame. He could still feel the heat radiating from her feverish skin, could still hear the faint sound of her shallow, labored breathing. But it was her eyes, those deep brown eyes filled with an overwhelming, unspoken fear, that kept him on edge. As he started the engine and began to drive through the storm, John kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, his heart heavy with concern. The girl, Emma, seemed to be drifting in and out of consciousness. Her small, frail body barely stirred. But her eyes, those eyes, seemed to be constantly searching, as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. It made his stomach churn with unease, as though she were afraid of what might be lurking in the shadows just beyond the car's headlights. And then, just as John turned his attention back to the road, her voice broke the silence, barely a whisper, but enough to send a chill down his spine. Don't take me back." The words struck him like a physical blow. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as his heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice gentle, trying to keep his composure despite the rising tension in his chest. But the girl only shifted slightly, her small body trembling under the blanket. Her eyes fluttered open again, this time meeting his with an expression that was more terror than confusion. "Don't take me back," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, her words carrying a weight that was almost too much to bear. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The fear in her eyes was enough. It was a look John had seen before, a look that mirrored the one he had seen in his own daughter's eyes the night she disappeared. John froze for a moment, the words ringing in his ears. The memory of his daughter, Lily, flooded back to him with crushing intensity. He had never been able to protect her in the way a father should. He had failed her in the most fundamental way, and the guilt had haunted him for years. It was as though the little girl in the back seat was a mirror of his own past, a past that still tortured him. He couldn't help but see the parallel. The fear in Emma's eyes was too familiar. It was the same look his daughter had given him right before she was taken. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "Don't take me back." He swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising tide of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He could feel the same protective instinct surge through him that he had felt when Lily was still alive, still in his care. But this was different. This wasn't his daughter. This was a child he had just met, a child who was alone, shivering, terrified of something that she couldn't explain. He wanted to help her. He had to help her. "Hey, Emma," John said softly, trying to break through her fear, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm. "You're safe now. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You're with me." But Emma didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, her eyes remained wide and terrified, darting around the car as if she was expecting something to jump out from the shadows. Her tiny fingers clutched at the blanket around her, gripping it with an almost painful intensity. John's heart ached as he watched her, knowing that whatever she had been through was far worse than anything he could imagine. The fear was so deeply ingrained in her that it seemed to have taken root in her very being. As he drove, his mind wandered back to his own memories, to the dark days when Lily had disappeared without a trace. She had been only 5 at the time, too young to understand what had happened, too young to fight back. John had tried everything, searching for clues, investigating every possible lead, but it had all been in vain. The pain of not knowing, of not having answers, still gnawed at him, even after all these years. He had never been able to protect her, and now here he was, with another child who needed protection, someone who, for reasons unknown, was afraid of being taken back to wherever she had come from. The parallels were unmistakable. The way Emma clung to him, the way she whispered those chilling words, "Don't take me back," reminded him so much of Lily. It was as though the fear Emma carried was a reflection of his own guilt. He couldn't help but wonder, was this child somehow connected to his own pain? Was she another lost soul, like his daughter, caught in a nightmare beyond her control? John's thoughts were interrupted when he heard a faint sound from the back seat. It was Emma again, her voice weak but insistent. "They'll find me," she whispered, her voice shaking. They'll know where I am." John's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. Who would find her? And why was she so terrified of being found? He stole another glance at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, as though she was seeing something beyond the car, beyond the road, something that only she could see. The fear was palpable, almost suffocating, and it made John's chest tighten with unease. There was something about this girl, something about the way she was behaving, that told him she wasn't just a child lost in a storm. She had a past, a dangerous, twisted past that she wasn't ready to reveal. "Who's going to find you, Emma?" John asked gently, his voice filled with concern. He needed answers, but he didn't want to push her too hard. She was already on edge, her body trembling, her mind clearly battling with something she couldn't understand. The girl's lips trembled, her small frame shaking under the weight of the words she was trying to say. She opened her mouth, but then closed it again as if the words were stuck in her throat. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice so quiet that it was almost drowned out by the storm outside. They're always looking," she whispered. "They're never far. They'll come for me. They always do." John's heart sank. The terror in her voice was unmistakable, and the words carried a weight of truth that he couldn't ignore. Who was she talking about? Who were they? The girl's fear had become his own. The questions were multiplying, but the answers seemed to elude him at every turn. Whoever had hurt Emma, whoever had put this terror into her heart, was still out there, waiting, and John had just stepped into the middle of a story far darker than he had imagined. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that raged within the girl in the back seat. He had no idea who she was running from or what had happened to her. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her slip through his fingers. Whatever it took, he would protect her. As they drove toward the hospital, the minutes felt like hours. John's mind raced with questions, but he pushed them aside. For now, he needed to focus on getting Emma the help she so desperately needed. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that her nightmare was just beginning, and that he was about to be swept up into a story that would change both of their lives forever. Officer John Parker's heart pounded in his chest as he gently scooped the small, trembling girl into his arms. Her frail body barely registered against him as he carefully lifted her, feeling the fever that raged through her skin, making her almost burn to the touch. He had always been used to the weight of his uniform, the reassuring weight of authority he carried on his shoulders. But in that moment, the girl felt like the heaviest burden he'd ever had to bear. With practiced urgency, John moved quickly, his boots splashing in the growing puddles on the road as the rain continued to pour down around them. He barely noticed the cold, the way the rain soaked through his uniform as his mind was laser-focused on the child in his arms. Every step he took was filled with a kind of desperation, an overwhelming sense of responsibility that he hadn't felt in years. He was her protector now, her only hope, and the weight of that role pressed on him like the storm itself. As he reached his patrol car, he gently opened the door, his hands shaking slightly as he settled the girl in the back seat. She was barely conscious now, her body still trembling, her head lolling to one side. The blanket he had wrapped around her looked tiny against her small form, but it was all he had to offer her. Her brown eyes flickered open for a moment, meeting his gaze through the rearview mirror. She didn't speak, but the silence in the car was deafening. The only sound was the storm. Rain tapping against the windshield, the wind howling, and the occasional crack of thunder that shook the car. John slammed the door shut with a sense of finality and climbed into the front seat, his hands tight on the steering wheel. His mind raced. He had to get her to the hospital now. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and with each passing second, Emma's life seemed more fragile. But even as he focused on the road, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that gripped him. Something about this whole situation didn't feel right. He glanced at her once more through the rearview mirror. Her eyes were closed again, her face pale and gaunt, but there was a look of silent terror still etched into her features. John's heart ached. She had been through something horrible, something that had left her broken in ways he couldn't understand. Whatever had happened to her, whatever dark past she was running from, it was clear she was terrified. As he started to drive, his thoughts were clouded by more questions than answers. Who was she? Why was she out there alone? And who was she hiding from? He couldn't shake the image of her face, the way she had looked at him with those wide, fearful eyes, as though she had been waiting for him to come, as though she had known he was the one person who could protect her from whatever nightmare she was living. John knew he had to get answers, but how could he when the girl barely spoke? Every time he tried to get her to tell him more, she had fallen silent, retreating into her own world of fear and confusion. He needed to know where she had come from, what had happened to her, and why she was so afraid. "Hey, Emma," John said softly, trying to break the silence. "You're going to be okay. We're almost to the hospital. Just hang on a little longer." His voice was low, trying to reassure her, but his words felt hollow. The storm outside raged as if it had a life of its own, and the only thing John could focus on was getting her the medical attention she desperately needed. The girl didn't respond. She had barely spoken since he'd found her, her words only a whisper, as if she had no strength left to speak. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, watching her fragile form as she lay slumped in the back seat, her head resting against the seat, her hands clenched tightly in the blanket. Every now and then, he caught the faintest tremor running through her small body, and it made him shudder. John tried again, keeping his voice calm, even though his own heart was racing with fear. "Emma," he said gently, his eyes on the road ahead, "where did you come from? How did you end up out here, all alone?" He waited, but there was no answer. She only shifted slightly, her eyes flickering open and then closing again, as though the effort of staying awake was too much for her. The silence between them stretched on, filled only by the sound of the rain and the engine humming beneath him. John's frustration grew. "Come on, kid, just tell me what happened." But he knew better than to push too hard. He could feel her fear, feel the walls she had built around herself, and he didn't want to make it worse. He needed to gain her trust. But how could he do that when he didn't even understand what she was running from? As the minutes ticked by, John drove through the storm, the roads growing slicker with each passing moment. He could feel the weight of the girl's silence pressing down on him, and with it, the unspoken fear that seemed to pulse from her in waves. Every so often, she would stir, her body shaking, and he would glance at her, his heart clenching in his chest. "Emma, I'm here," he said softly, trying once more to reach her. "I'm not going anywhere. You're safe with me." His voice was barely audible over the roar of the storm, but he said it anyway, needing to hear it himself, needing to believe that somehow he could help her. This time, she responded. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it sent a chill down John's spine. "I can't go back," she murmured. Her words were faint, but the terror in them was unmistakable. "I can't go back to where I was." John's grip on the steering wheel tightened. What did she mean by that? The cryptic words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for the first time, John felt the full weight of the situation. Whatever was going on, it was more than just a missing child. It was something darker, something far more complicated. He tried to focus on the road, but his mind was racing. Who was she running from? What had happened to her? The questions pounded in his brain, each one more pressing than the last. He needed answers, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the answers might not be so simple. There was something about this whole situation that didn't make sense, something that was beyond his ability to fix in the moment. The minutes stretched on as John drove through the storm, his mind consumed with worry. The hospital was still several miles away, and Emma's condition seemed to worsen with every passing second. Her breathing was labored, shallow, and her fever was dangerously high. He could see her body jerking with tremors from the cold, and each time she shivered, John felt a pang of helplessness. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror again. Her face was pale, her eyes closed tightly, as if she were retreating into herself, shutting out the world around her. John wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but something told him that the storm outside was just a small reflection of the storm brewing inside her. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, the rain continuing to batter the car, the wind howling like an animal in pain. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the headlights slicing through the darkness. In the back seat, Emma remained motionless, her small frame curled tightly beneath the blanket. Her silence weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the uncertainty that surrounded her. John's thoughts were interrupted as he saw the faint outline of the hospital in the distance. It was still several minutes away, but it felt like an eternity. He pushed the car harder, willing himself to get there faster, even though he knew the storm was only getting worse. The girl needed help. She needed answers, and somehow he had to provide both. As the car finally pulled up to the hospital, John's heart was still pounding in his chest. He had driven through the storm with the girl by his side, but the Rayall journey was just beginning. Whatever had brought Emma to this moment, whatever darkness she had been running from, was far from over. And as he carried her into the hospital, he knew that he was about to uncover a story far darker than anything he could have imagined. The rain still poured down outside as Officer John Parker arrived at Pinewood General Hospital, his patrol car skidding to a stop beneath the bright lights of the emergency entrance. His hands were still shaking as he lifted the little girl from the back seat, her fragile body limp in his arms. Despite the warmth of the car, she was burning with fever, her small frame trembling under the weight of both the cold and the illness that racked her body. The storm outside seemed to pale in comparison to the storm of uncertainty that swirled around him, the questions piling up faster than he could process them. John hurried through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, his boots clicking loudly against the polished floor, his eyes scanning the room for anyone who could help. He had no idea what he was walking into. All he knew was that this little girl, this fragile soul who had appeared from nowhere, needed help immediately. As he rushed toward the nurse's station, he barely noticed the frantic activity going on around him. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a buzz of controlled chaos as doctors and nurses moved swiftly, responding to the variety of emergencies that the night had thrown their way. At the nurse's station, a tall, calm woman with a clipboard glanced up at him. She seemed unfazed by the storm of activity around them. "What do we have here?" she asked in a clear, professional tone, though her eyes immediately focused on the pale, feverish girl in John's arms. "Found her in the woods," John explained quickly, his voice tight with anxiety. "She's burning up with fever. Her clothes are soaked, and she looks malnourished. I'm not sure what's going on, but she's scared. She keeps saying she can't go back. His voice trailed off, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. The nurse nodded with a calm efficiency that John found reassuring. "We'll take care of her," she said. "Get her to room 4. Dr. Sarah Mitchell will be in immediately." Without another word, she turned and led him down the sterile, brightly lit hallway, her steps quick and purposeful. John followed, his mind racing as he tried to focus on the task at hand. The girl's soft breathing and trembling body were all he could think about as they reached the door of the examination room. He stepped inside with her, but as soon as he did, the door swung open behind him, and a new presence filled the room. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was exactly what John had hoped for, calm, collected, and ready to act. Her long, dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her white coat fit her tall, lean frame perfectly. At first glance, she seemed like just another doctor, but it was the sharp focus in her eyes and the confident manner in which she carried herself that told John she was someone who knew how to handle a crisis. "Let's take a look at her," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice smooth yet firm. She didn't waste any time. As soon as she took in the child's condition, her eyes moved quickly over the little girl's body, noting the flushed cheeks, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, and the shivering tremors that racked her body. John carefully placed Emma on the examination table, his heart sinking as he took in the sight of her. She seemed so small, so fragile. Her face pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and too many days without proper care. Dr. Mitchell immediately began her assessment. "Her fever's dangerously high," Dr. Mitchell muttered as she felt Emma's forehead with the back of her hand. "She's burning up. We need to bring it down immediately." John nodded, stepping back to give the doctor space. His mind was still reeling. He had never been a stranger to seeing people in pain, but there was something about this little girl's condition that unsettled him in ways he couldn't put into words. It wasn't just the fever, it was the look in her eyes, the silence she carried with her, the fear that she seemed unable to shake off. As Dr. Mitchell worked quickly to take Emma's vitals, she paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the child's arms. John noticed it too, the faint, almost faded bruises that mar her skin. They weren't new. They were old, the kind that had been there for a long time, healing but still visible. "Has she been hurt recently?" Dr. Mitchell asked without looking up, her tone gentle but laced with concern. John swallowed hard. "I'm not sure. I didn't see any fresh injuries when I found her. But she looks like she hasn't been taken care of in a while. She was alone in the woods, soaked to the bone. Something's not right here." Dr. Mitchell nodded, her expression grim. "It looks like she's been through something difficult, but it's not just physical trauma. There's something deeper here." Her voice was steady, but John could hear the concern beneath it. As Dr. Mitchell continued her examination, her fingers gently tracing over Emma's frail arms, she noticed the same thing that John had, Emma's haunted eyes. They were filled with something dark, something John couldn't quite place, but it was there. Fear, confusion, and perhaps even the lingering echoes of something terrible. "Can you tell me where you're from, sweetie?" Dr. Mitchell asked in the softest voice possible, bending down so that she was at eye level with Emma. The girl's response was barely a whisper. "I don't remember," she said, her voice cracking, "but I remember them." Dr. Mitchell's eyebrows furrowed as she exchanged a quick glance with John. There was something in the girl's words that sent a shiver down their spines. The fear in her voice spoke of something more than just a lost child. "Do you remember where you were before the storm?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her voice still gentle, though there was a sense of urgency now. She was trying to piece together the puzzle of this little girl's past, but the pieces weren't fitting. The girl looked at Dr. Mitchell, her lips trembling, but she didn't respond. She simply stared, her eyes unfocused, as if she were looking at something far beyond the room, something invisible. Dr. Mitchell sighed and turned to John. "She's been through something traumatic. Physically, she's malnourished, her fever is high, and she's clearly dehydrated. But emotionally, there's a lot we don't know." John nodded, his stomach twisting. There was so much more to this story than the girl's condition. She wasn't just a missing child. She was a child with a past, one that was too painful for her to even speak about. We need to get a full medical history on her, Dr. Mitchell continued. And we need to address the trauma she's experienced, both physical and emotional. But we can't do that unless she feels safe enough to talk. As Dr. Mitchell worked to stabilize Emma's condition, the door to the room opened again, and a new figure stepped inside. Olivia Brooks, Pinewood County's child welfare specialist, was a calm and collected woman in her late 20s. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose bun, and she wore a professional but empathetic expression. She had seen children in every imaginable situation, but there was something about Emma that tugged at her heartstrings. "Is she okay?" Olivia asked as she approached the table, her gaze immediately flicking to Emma's frail form. "She's stable for now," Dr. Mitchell replied, "but we need to figure out what happened to her. She's been through something. This girl has more scars than we can see." Olivia nodded, her brow furrowing as she glanced at Emma's arms. The faded bruises, the way she seemed so withdrawn, the terror in her eyes, it was all too familiar. "I've seen this before," Olivia said quietly, "but this child is more scared than most. We need to know everything we can about her, and we need to find out who did this to her." John stepped back, his mind racing with the new developments. The situation was becoming far more complicated than he had imagined. There were too many unanswered questions, and the deeper they went, the more disturbing it became. Emma had been through something unimaginable, something that left her not just physically scarred, but emotionally shattered. And it was up to them, the doctors, the officers, and the child welfare workers, to piece together the pieces of her broken past. As they worked, Emma remained silent, her eyes flickering open and closed, caught somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. She was no longer trembling, but the fear in her gaze never fully left. The road ahead was uncertain, and the truth of her past seemed elusive, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of a much larger story. As Officer John Parker sat in the sterile, quiet waiting room of Pinewood General Hospital, his mind raced with questions. The storm had subsided, but the weight of the mystery surrounding the little girl, Emma, or was it Sarah, only seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. He had come to the hospital hoping to find answers, to uncover some clue that would explain how she ended up on a deserted forest road, feverish and trembling in the middle of night. Yet as the hours dragged on, the answers seemed farther and farther away. John had spent the better part of a night searching through the missing persons database, running the girl's description through every channel he had at his disposal. But no reports matched her. There was no record of a missing child who fit her age, her appearance, or her condition. He had even contacted local law enforcement from neighboring counties, but no one had seen or heard anything that could explain her disappearance. It was as if she had simply appeared out of nowhere. The more John thought about it, the more he felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. The girl didn't just seem out of place, she seemed as if she didn't belong in this world at all. Her clothes were worn and ragged, not from the storm, but from days, maybe weeks, of neglect. Her body had been weak, too frail for her age, as if she hadn't been cared for in the way a child should. There were dark bruises on her legs, and the faded scars on her arms spoke of something more than just accidental injuries. These weren't marks from a few days ago. They were from a long time ago. Injuries that had been left untreated, scars that ran deep in both her body and her soul. As the storm outside died down and the hospital began to quiet, John found himself standing by the window, staring into the now calm night. The girl's face haunted him. Her eyes, so wide, so filled with fear, had burned themselves into his mind. What was it about her that made him feel like this was more than just a routine case? He had dealt with missing children before, with runaways and lost souls, but this was different. Something told him that the answers he was looking for weren't going to be easy to find. John turned when he heard the door open behind him. Dr. Sarah Mitchell walked in, her expression tired but determined. Her gaze immediately flicked to the small chart in her hands before resting on John's face. "She's stable now," she said, her voice steady. "Her fever's down and she's asleep." But she paused as if weighing how much to say. There's something strange about her medical records, or rather, the lack of them. John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" There's no history, Dr. Mitchell replied, her voice lowering as she spoke. No doctor's visits, no vaccinations, no records of any kind. It's as if she's never been to a medical professional before, at least not officially. And I've checked, nothing in the system matches her. It's like she's disappeared. Completely. The words hit John like a hammer. How was that possible? A child her age had no history? No medical records? No one had ever reported her missing or sought help for her. The implications were staggering. Do you think she could be lying? John asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Dr. Mitchell shook her head. I don't think so. Her condition is consistent with someone who has been neglected or hidden away for a long time. Physically, she's in pretty bad shape. But mentally, there's something even more concerning. She glanced at John, her eyes darkening. She's terrified. And she's not just afraid of the storm. She's afraid of something or someone. And that fear is so deep-rooted, it's almost primal. John's stomach tightened. What does she think is after her? Dr. Mitchell hesitated. She hasn't said much, but there are fragments. She talks about them, a group of people who are always looking for her, people she's been hiding from. She says that she can't be found, that if they find her, something terrible will happen. She's too young to understand the weight of her words, but there's a seriousness in her voice that makes me think she's telling the truth. John ran a hand through his hair, frustration building in his chest. This wasn't just some runaway child, some lost soul with a sad backstory. This girl was hiding something. She was afraid of something so deeply embedded in her past that she couldn't even bring herself to talk about it. And he was determined to find out what that was. Just then, a nurse entered the room, interrupting the conversation. She carried a small tray of food, but her eyes were focused on Dr. Mitchell. Doctor, the girl is awake, she said. She's asking for Officer Parker. John's heart skipped. She wanted to see him? It had only been a few hours since he'd last spoken to her. But something about the request made him uneasy. Was she ready to talk? Or was this just another piece of the puzzle that would raise even more questions? Go, Dr. Mitchell urged him, her voice soft but firm. But be careful. She's not ready to talk yet. But if she's asking for you, maybe this is the moment we've been waiting for. John nodded, his pulse quickening as he followed the nurse down the hallway to the small room where the girl had been placed. As they entered, he could see her lying on the bed, her body still small and fragile beneath the hospital sheets. Her eyes were open now, though they were clouded with confusion and fear. But there was something else, something new in her gaze. It was as if she had made a decision, as if she was ready to say something important. Emma? John said softly as he stepped into the room. You asked for me? The girl looked at him, her face still pale, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She nodded slowly, then whispered, I'm not Emma. John's heart seemed to stop in his chest. His mind raced, trying to process her words. What do you mean? Who are you? The girl's eyes flickered with fear as she pulled the blanket tighter around her, her small fingers curling into the fabric. My name is Sarah, she whispered, her voice shaky, but that's not what they call me. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. Sarah? Who was she? And why had she said that wasn't the name they called her? This was the first real clue he had gotten, but it raised more questions than it answered. Who are they? John asked, his voice soft, but his heart pounding in his chest. Who calls you something else? The girl's face contorted with fear, her small body shaking under the blanket. She pressed her hand to her forehead, as though the words were causing her physical pain. I can't say. They'll know. They'll know I told you. John leaned in closer, trying to steady his own emotions. He knew this was important. The answer was right in front of him. Sarah, listen to me. You're safe now. Whatever happened to you, you don't have to hide anymore. I'm here to help. But she only shook her head, tears beginning to form her eyes. I'm not safe, she whispered. They'll come for me. And when they do, they'll take me back. They'll never let me go. John's heart sank as he tried to understand the weight of her words. Who were these people? What had happened to this little girl? And why was she so terrified of something so abstract? The name, Sarah, wasn't just a clue. It was a key to something far larger than he had anticipated. As he left her room, John felt a deep sense of urgency settle in his chest. He didn't know who Sarah was or where she came from, but one thing was clear: someone was after her, and he was running out of time to uncover the truth before it was too late. As Officer John Parker stood in the sterile hospital room, watching the little girl lying in the bed, his mind buzzed with questions. She was asleep now, her face flushed with fever, her body barely stirring beneath the hospital sheets. He had done everything he could to get her help, to get her to a safe place, but there was a gnawing feeling deep in his gut that told him this wasn't over. The discovery of Emma, Sarah, or whatever her real name was, had only just scratched the surface of a much darker mystery, one that was far more complicated than he had first imagined. John's thoughts drifted back to the moments after he had first found the girl in the woods, when he had been forced to make snap decisions and act quickly, not fully understanding the weight of the situation. His mind replayed every moment: the terror in her eyes, the cryptic words she had whispered to him, the frailty of her small form as she trembled in his arms. He couldn't shake the image of her wide, fearful eyes, the look of someone who had been running from something for far too long. But now, as she rested in the hospital bed, his thoughts drifted to something that had been nagging at him ever since he had found her: the discovery of her clothes. John had gone through them briefly when he first found her, but it hadn't been until later, after Emma, Sarah, had been settled into the hospital, that he had had the chance to really examine her clothing. There had been no identification on her, no sign that she had belonged anywhere to anyone. No tags, no name written inside, nothing that could give him a clue as to who she really was or where she came from. As he sat down in a chair by the window, the afternoon sun casting a faint glow over the room, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the mystery still hanging in the air. The child had been through something horrific, and it was clear that she was hiding something. She had mentioned that she couldn't go back, that there were people looking for her. But who were they? And why was she so terrified of being found? Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped in, looking a little more relaxed than the last time he had seen her. She gave him a quick nod, signaling that she had an update. John stood up, his mind still clouded with questions, but he was eager for any kind of information that might shed light on the girl's past. "How's she doing?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "She's stable," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice professional but kind. "Her fever's down, and she's resting now. She's still weak, but there's nothing we can't treat. She's safe now." John nodded, relieved but still uneasy. "I'm glad to hear that. But what about the rest of it?" he asked, his voice dropping lower as he motioned toward the girl's bed. "What happened to her, Doc? There's got to be more to this. I've checked every report, every missing persons database I could find. No one is looking for her. She has no identification, no history. It's like she doesn't even exist." Dr. Mitchell frowned, clearly troubled by the same questions. "I know. We've never seen anything quite like this before. She's not your typical runaway or lost child. She's been through something that's left its mark on her, physically and emotionally." John didn't respond immediately, his mind racing. He stood up and walked over to the side of the bed, his eyes flicking to Emma's small, frail body. There was still so much he didn't understand about her, and the more he tried to dig, the more elusive the answers became. But something kept nagging at him, something wasn't right. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "I need to go over her clothes again. There's something I missed. Something important." Dr. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him. "Go ahead," she said with a nod. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." John turned his attention back to the girl. He had already gone through her clothes once, but now, as he looked at her small frame lying so still in the bed, he felt a sense of resolve. There had to be something hidden, something that could give him the answers he was searching for. Slowly, he reached for the clothes she had been wearing when he found her. They were damp, tattered, and far too small for her, but there was something about the way they clung to her body that told John these weren't just clothes a child would wear by accident. Whoever had put her in these clothes had done so with intention, either to hide her or to keep her from being found. He carefully pulled the damp jacket off her small shoulders and began to inspect it more closely. As he ran his fingers over the worn fabric, something caught his attention. A small, hidden pocket along the side of the jacket. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed almost too obvious to ignore. John's pulse quickened as he reached inside the pocket, his fingers brushing against something hard. At first, he thought it was a button or some sort of trinket, but when he pulled it out, he realized it was a small, folded piece of paper. His breath caught in his throat as he carefully unfolded it, revealing the yellowed edges and faint, almost faded ink. The words on the paper were clear, though written in a hurried, shaky hand. "Do not trust anyone." John's heart skipped a beat. The words on the paper hit him like a ton of bricks. It was a warning. But from who? And why was it hidden in the clothes of a child who had no memory of her life before this moment? The implications of the note made his head spin. Who had given it to her? Who had warned her not to trust anyone? And why had she been carrying it all this time, tucked away in the hidden pocket of her jacket? John felt the weight of the paper in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He had thought this case was complicated before, but this note made it clear that things were far deeper, far darker than he had imagined. Emma, or Sarah, wasn't just running from some random threat. She had been warned. She had been prepared for something or someone, and whoever was after her wasn't someone she could just escape from. He quickly folded the paper back up, his mind racing. What was the connection? Who was this girl? What had happened to her? And who was threatening her? The questions seemed to grow exponentially with every new clue, every new piece of information he uncovered. John stood there for a moment, holding the paper in his hand, his mind swirling with possibilities. He had never encountered anything like this before. A child with no history, no past, no identity, and now a cryptic message warning her not to trust anyone. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Just then, he heard the faint sound of movement from the bed behind him. He turned to find Emma, or Sarah, looking at him, her eyes wide with fear. She had woken up, and though her fever had broken, the confusion and terror in her eyes had not. "Did you find it?" she whispered, her voice shaking. John's heart sank. He hadn't even realized she was awake. Slowly, he walked over to the bed, sitting down beside her. He held the note in his hand, but he didn't show it to her. Instead, he focused on her eyes, those dark, terrified eyes. "Emma," he said gently, "you don't have to be scared anymore. You're safe now." She shook her head, her lips trembling. "I'm not safe," she whispered. "They'll find me. They always do." John took a deep breath. This was it, the moment when everything could change. He had the paper, the warning, and now it was time to understand who was behind it all. But as he looked into Emma's eyes, he knew this was only the beginning. There were far more layers to peel back, and the darkness of her past was only just starting to unfold. Officer John Parker's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway of Pinewood General Hospital, the sound amplifying the internal storm brewing inside him. He had done his best to stay detached, to remain the professional, the officer who followed the rules. But the longer he stayed by the little girl's side, the more that detachment slipped away. It was hard to keep his emotions in check when the child in question was as fragile as she was, both physically and emotionally. Her face, still pale with the remnants of fever, her wide, terrified eyes. They were like mirrors to his own lost daughter, Lily, who had disappeared years ago. But Lily was gone. This girl, this child, was not his responsibility. She wasn't his daughter. She wasn't his to protect. And yet every time he saw her trembling, every time she looked at him with those desperate eyes, a part of him felt like he couldn't let go. John paced the length of the small room where the girl, Emma or Sarah, he still didn't know for sure, had been resting since the storm had subsided. He had spent hours sitting by her bedside, trying to understand her. The cryptic note he had found hidden in her jacket pocket had only deepened the mystery, and the more he uncovered, the less he seemed to understand. One moment she was calm and talking to him, and the next she was pulling away, scared of the very people who were trying to help her. It had only been a few days since Emma or Sarah had been found in the woods, but the emotional toll on John was already immense. His connection to her was undeniable. There was something about her that resonated with him, something that felt like a broken mirror of his own life, a child who had been hurt and hidden away, just like Lily. And that connection made everything harder. He had to stay professional. He had to follow the protocol. He had to find out who she was, who was after her, and what had happened to her. But every time he spoke to her, every time she looked up at him with those pleading eyes, it became harder and harder to remember that he was not her father, that he was not responsible for a future. He was just an officer doing his job, but could he really turn his back on her now? Could he walk away from a child who needed him, who had so little left to hold on to? John stopped pacing, his hands gripping the edge of the windowsill as he stared out into the stormy night. The wind howled, the rain tapping at the glass, but inside, the silence was deafening. How long could he keep up this charade? He wondered. He had made a promise to himself when he joined the force that he would always do his duty, that he would follow the law no matter what. But this wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about a child. This was about a girl who had no one else to turn to, a girl who had been through something unspeakable and was clearly terrified of being found. Who could he trust? He trusted Dr. Sarah Mitchell, of course. The doctor had done everything in her power to make Emma feel safe, to ensure her well-being. But there was something off about Emma's behavior. Something wasn't right. She would open up for a moment, only to retreat the next. She would speak in fragmented sentences, barely able to form a coherent thought. Yet her eyes held a knowledge, a depth of fear, that made it clear she had lived through something much darker than any child should have to face. But it wasn't just the girl's actions that troubled him, it was the people she spoke of, the ones she had been hiding from. Who were they? John's mind replayed her words. They'll find me. They always do. They'll never stop looking. The thought gnawed at him. These were not the words of a child who had simply gotten lost in the woods. There was something more at play, something deeper. And as the days passed, John began to feel as though he were diving into a rabbit hole he wasn't prepared to explore. The more questions he asked, the more the mystery deepened. And then there was the matter of trust. Every time Emma had spoken to him, her words had been laced with fear. She was scared of him, scared of everyone around her. But she trusted him in some way. He had seen it in her eyes, felt it in the way she had reached for his hand when she was scared. And that trust was both a burden and a blessing. He couldn't let her down, not again. Not after losing his own daughter. But there were people in his life who weren't so quick to trust him, people who had doubts about his involvement in the case. His supervisor, Captain Harris, had made it clear that he was getting too personally involved. The captain had pulled him aside several times, urging him to step back, to remain objective. Harris was right to be cautious, of course. Officers couldn't get too close to a case like this. It was easy to get emotionally involved, but that could cloud judgment. It could lead to mistakes, bad decisions, and in the worst case, jeopardize the investigation altogether. But how could he step back? How could he turn his back on a child who was so desperately in need of protection? How could he walk away from her when she had no one else? John sighed and rubbed his temples, his mind swirling with frustration. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fear that Emma had been running from, or the possibility that he was becoming too emotionally involved in her case. There were so many unanswered questions, and he was stuck in the middle of it all, unable to choose between his duty as a police officer and his growing attachment to the girl he had promised to protect. The door opened softly and Dr. Mitchell stepped in, her face tired but compassionate. She had been his rock throughout this ordeal, the one person who seemed to understand his concerns without judgment. She gave him a warm smile, though her eyes were filled with concern. "John," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I think we need to talk." John nodded, motioning for her to sit down. He knew what this was about. He had seen the warning signs. Dr. Mitchell was concerned, and rightly so. The more time they spent together, the more she had started to notice his growing attachment to the girl. I know what you're going to say, John said before she could speak. But I can't just let her go. She needs me. She needs someone. Dr. Mitchell sighed, sitting down next to him. I understand, John. I really do. But you can't protect her from everything. There are things going on here that we don't fully understand. We don't even know where she came from, let alone who's after her. The more you invest in this case emotionally, the harder it's going to be for you to see things clearly. John turned his gaze to the floor, unable to meet her eyes. He knew she was right. He had been blinded by his need to protect Emma, his desire to make things right, to atone for the mistakes he had made with Lily. But at what cost? If he kept pushing forward, kept getting more and more emotionally involved, what would happen when the truth finally came out? What if it was more than he could handle? I know I'm not supposed to get involved like this, John said quietly, his voice filled with regret. But I don't know how to stop. I feel like I'm the only one who can protect her. And if I walk away now, if I let someone else take over, I'll never forgive myself. Dr. Mitchell placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a comforting squeeze. I'm not asking you to walk away, John, but you need to understand that you're not alone in this. You don't have to carry all the weight of her past. There are people who can help. Let us do our part, and you can focus on doing yours. We'll figure this out together. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that the people around him could help Emma, that they could protect her from whatever darkness had followed her. But as he looked into Dr. Mitchell's kind eyes, he knew that he was caught in a struggle between what was right and what felt like a personal mission to fix everything that had gone wrong in his own life. I'll try, John said finally, his voice soft but resolute. But I can't promise I'll be able to let go. Not yet. Dr. Mitchell smiled, a faint, understanding smile. I didn't expect you to. But at least now you're aware of the conflict. The rest will come in time. John nodded, though his heart remained heavy. The conflict wasn't over. It was just beginning. And as he walked out of the room, he knew that no matter what happened, he couldn't walk away from Emma. Not now. Not ever. As Officer John Parker sat in the quiet hospital hallway, his mind raced through the labyrinth of questions and uncertainties that had been swirling around him for days. He had made a promise to protect the girl, to find out who was after her, and to make sure she was safe. But the deeper he dug, the more elusive the answers became. Emma, or Sarah, had finally begun to open up, but there was so much she wasn't saying, so much she was keeping hidden behind those fearful eyes. The cryptic note, the whispers of people she was running from, the constant fear that gripped her, it all pointed to something much darker than he had anticipated. He stood up, stretching his stiff legs, and walked over to the window, looking out at the night that had now settled over Pinewood County. The storm had passed, but the unsettling sense of dread in the air seemed to hang over everything like a heavy fog. John had always trusted his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was telling him that something huge was about to unfold. But what? As if on cue, the door to the waiting area creaked open, and Officer John turned to find Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepping into the hallway. She was holding a clipboard, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held a glimmer of something, concern perhaps? Or was it something else? John, she said, her voice low, I think we've made a breakthrough with Emma. She's agreed to talk. I think she's ready to tell us what happened. John's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the chance to finally get answers, to finally understand what was really going on. But as he took a step toward Dr. Mitchell, ready to follow her back into the room, a shadow fell across the hallway, halting him in his tracks. A man, a tall, imposing figure in a dark suit, with an air of authority that made the hairs on the back of John's neck stand up. He walked toward them with a slow, purposeful gait, his face cold, unreadable. In one hand, he held a badge that gleamed under the fluorescent hospital lights, and in the other, a briefcase that seemed far too official for the situation at hand. John's heart sank. Something about this man felt off, like a predator circling its prey. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but instinct told him that this man wasn't here for good reasons. The man approached John and Dr. Mitchell with a calm, almost rehearsed confidence. "Officer Parker," he said in a voice that was all business, "I need to speak with the girl. She's ours." John froze, his blood running cold. "Yours?" he repeated, his voice steady but edged with confusion. "What do you mean, yours? Who are you?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he flashed his badge again, his face still inscrutable. "I'm Special Agent Cole. I'm with the federal agency." He paused for a moment, his gaze flicking to Dr. Mitchell before returning to John. "This child is involved in something much larger than you understand. I'm afraid it's no longer your jurisdiction." John's pulse quickened. The words felt like a slap in the face. He had been so focused on the girl's safety, on protecting her, that he hadn't even considered the possibility of a bigger force at play. But now, as Agent Cole's cold eyes bore into his, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled onto something far darker than he could have imagined. "I don't care who you are," John said, his voice rising despite himself. "This girl is under my protection. She's scared, she's been through hell, and I'm not handing her over to anyone until I know exactly who's involved and what's really going on." Agent Cole didn't flinch. He simply took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You've already made your mistake by getting involved, officer. But now, you're making another. I'm giving you one chance to step aside. We're taking her in." John's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the decision was suffocating. Everything in him screamed to protect Emma, to keep her safe from whatever this man and his agency were planning. But there was something more pressing now. Something about this whole situation was unraveling, and it was becoming clear that there were forces beyond his control. Dr. Mitchell's voice broke through the tension, calm but insistent. "I think we need to discuss this further." But before John could respond, Agent Cole took a step back, his cold smile returning. "This isn't up for discussion. The girl is coming with me, and you're making a very dangerous choice if you stand in my way." The room fell silent as John's mind raced. Was this really just a federal case? Or was there something far more sinister at play? As the agent turned to leave, the weight of his words hung in the air. "We'll be back," Agent Cole said, ominously as he walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. "And when we do, you'll wish you hadn't interfered." John stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to move, to do something, anything to stop this, but as the silence settled around him, a sense of dread began to creep in. The bigger picture was starting to reveal itself, and it was much worse than he had imagined. Dr. Mitchell placed a gentle hand on John's shoulder. "You've got to be careful now, John," she said quietly. "You've stirred up something much bigger than you realize." John nodded slowly, his mind still racing. Whatever this man's intentions were, whatever larger force was in play, he couldn't ignore the fact that Emma, Sarah, was in even more danger than he had first realized. And as he stood there, alone in the hallway, a cold realization washed over him. The real battle was only just beginning. Want to know what happens next? The truth behind this story is more shocking than you can imagine. Don't miss out on the next part. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more incredible updates. And make sure to leave a comment below with your thoughts on what Agent Cole's intentions really are. Stay connected with us on HOA Denied Access. Subscribe now.